Hi guys! In this lecture, I will show you how to create a S3 bucket in the AWS console and then using CDK. Okay, let's tour S3 together and create our first bucket. As usual, you can go in the search bar, type S3, and here we go. So first, you will see that in the buckets list, we have already one bucket created by CDK. It's perfectly normal. To give you a little bit more detail, there is a tool in AWS Cloud Formation. Cloud Formation here. And this tool enables us to deploy our stack. So what CDK does, CDK takes the code that you wrote, then it will transform that into a JSON file that CloudFormation can understand. It will push that to CloudFormation, and CloudFormation will read the file, it's a JSON file, and create the infrastructure that you need. It means two things. It means that here in this CDK bucket, CDK will upload the JSON files that represent your architecture and your infrastructure. So that's why we have already a bucket in S3, and it happened when we bootstrap CDK. In the first lectures at the beginning of the course, we bootstrap CDK together. This is when this S3 bucket was created. And all those JSON files are different versions of your infrastructure that we deploy together. And in CloudFormation, you can see that we have our different stacks and the basic CDK toolkit. And if I click to the database stack, for example, you can see that the creation was complete. You can see the different events during the completion. You can see the resources that were created and so on. So this is also a good tips if you have any problems with CDK, if the infrastructure has started to be deployed, but has stopped for some reason, or if you had some error, you can always take a look at CloudFormation and check your different stack and check for any error. It may help you to debug and to find the issue and understand why CDK stopped processing your infrastructure. Okay, so now let's go back to S3 and our buckets. So let's tour that a little bit before creating our first bucket together. So here we have the list of buckets. Then access grants is just a way for you to manage accesses in if you have a lot of buckets. So if you have really a lot of buckets and a lot of objects in all those buckets, instead of bucket policies or ACLs, which is the old way to manage policies, you may need to use S3 access grants to fine-tune your accesses. But for this course, we will not use this tool. Access points, it's another tool of AWS to create a network endpoint to reach directly your bucket. But again, we don't need that for now. It's really an advanced topic. This is another advanced topic, the Lambda access points. So to explain this, let's say that you want to make a GET request to S3 to get a file. By default, we just get that file, but you can define a Lambda access point, and in that case, before you get the file will be sent to your Lambda. The Lambda will process the data and send you the output. So for example, if you have a CSV file stored in S3 and you need to process some rows for whatever reason, you can just create a Lambda access point, and each time you will do a GET request to get that CSV file, the row will be processed with your Lambda access point, and you will just get the output. Again, it's an advanced topic. We don't need that here. We have multi-region access points. This is useful when you have a lot of buckets across multiple regions. And this way you will have just one global endpoint to reach. And then you can define some rule to store the data in the right buckets in the right regions. But again, quite advanced topic. You can also perform some batch operations. So if you want to rename thousands of files in your S3 bucket, instead of doing it manually, you can do it with batch operations. And finally, if you change your bucket policy, your access point policy, or your ACLs, it will leave a trace and you will be able to find it here. If you enable AIM Access Analyzer, each time you make a change in your policies, it will be listed here. So it's very useful if for some compliance reason you need to check who changed which rules and privileges, you can use that tool. Here, you can disable or enable all public access. For now, you can see that everything is off. So we block all public access is off, meaning that it's not blocked. So we enable public access. You can do the change here on this level, and you can also do the setting on the bucket level. I'm going to show you that in a second. So it means that if you want a bucket to be public, for example, you want to share some pictures with your friends, for example, you need to turn off the public access here and inside the bucket settings. If you just turn off in one of the two, it's not enough. You really need to turn off for the two. That being said, most of the time, you don't want to turn off the public access settings because you don't want anyone to access your S3 buckets. So just make sure what you are going to do here. For this course, for this bucket, in this case, you can just turn it off because we want to store pictures in our bucket. And so for that, we want our users to be able to see those pictures. So we want to turn it off. And then we have storage lens. Storage lens, it's a tool to help you visualize all your data. So if again you have a lot of buckets in a lot of different regions with a lot of objects, if you need to have a better understanding of how your organization is using S3, you can go for storage lens. Okay, so this is the general tour. Just make sure that this is off, and then you can edit with this button if you need. And then let's create a bucket together. So here on bucket, you can create on create bucket. Let's give our bucket a name like test bucket 1, for example. You can also copy the settings from an existing bucket if you have one. And then you need to define if you want to use ACLs or not. ACLs is the old way to manage privileges with S3 bucket. Today now we use bucket policies. So by default, we'll use the recommended option and we'll disable ACLs. Then again, we have the public access that I just mentioned. So on the S3 side, we know that we turn off the public access. And now on the bucket side, we can enable or disable the public access. Here, we want to disable the public access because as I mentioned in our API, we want to show pictures or to your users. So we want to make sure that anyone can access this bucket. But as you can see now, we have a warning sign here and you need to acknowledge this. Otherwise, we'll not be able to create the bucket. Of course, if you're in production environment and you want to store some key information about your users, or if you store some data about your sales or marketing pipelines, you should not turn off the public access. It should be blocked. And then you have bucket versioning. So basically, when you have a new object in a bucket, you can decide to keep it in have a different version or just replace it with a new value. In this case, we will disable versioning because we don't need it, but it might be useful if you want to be sure that we'll always keep a trace of previous files. This way, each time you will update a new file with the same name, S3 will get that new file and upload it, but it will keep the old file as well. A bit like when you use Git and GitHub, you can just look through different versions of a file. It's the same way here. But just keep in mind that if you enable bucket versioning, it may increase your bill because you will store much, much more data. Again, we have some tags here if you want, and then you have the encryption. By default, we can go with the server-side encryption from Amazon. It's more than enough, but you can have other options like creating your own key if you want. And then you have one advanced setting about object lock. This is very specific for compliance need. If you enable object lock, it means that we'll be able to create the object only once, and you will never be able to modify this object. You will just be able to read it. It may be useful in the pharmaceutical industry or in the banking industry if you have to follow some rules. But here for this lecture, we don't need object lock, so we can keep disabled. And let's create our bucket. Oh, sorry. I made a mistake in my bucket name. We can't have. Okay, this name already exists, so let's try another one. Okay, so just as a reminder, bucket name must be unique. So it means that on all AWS accounts, all the buckets created must have a unique name. It's not only about your buckets inside your AWS account, it's really about all the buckets created with all the AWS accounts over the world. This is something very specific from AWS. You can't change that. So you may need to play a little bit here with some numbers to create a bucket that is new and that was never created. Okay, let's try to create again. Okay, it's going well. Okay, so now we have created our bucket. Let's click on our bucket to see even more information. So here we can see the objects that are stored in the bucket. For now, there are no objects. It's normal. We didn't upload anything. If you want to upload something, you can click on this upload button and you will be able to add some files and add and upload some data to your bucket. Feel free to do it if you want. And then you will see the object listed here. Then you have the general properties about your bucket, like bucket versioning that you mentioned and that kind of stuff. You have the permissions. You can turn on and turn off the public access policies, and you can also play with your bucket policy. You have some metrics about your bucket. You have some management tools like Lifecycle, for example. With Lifecycle, you can define some rules and say that, for example, after 60 days, I want to delete all those objects, or I want to move them to another storage type, and so on. You have also some replication rules. You may have, for example, two different buckets in two different regions. One bucket is your main bucket, and your second bucket is your archival bucket somehow. And so you can define some replication rule between those buckets. And you can also create an inventory. An inventory is just a list of all the objects that you have inside your S3 bucket, and you may use that list for example, performing some batch operations. And finally, the access points. So we already saw that earlier. It's a network endpoint attached to your bucket to make some modification directly to your bucket using this endpoint. Okay, so that's it for the console. Now we are going to create a new bucket using CDK. Okay, now let's deploy a S3 bucket together with CDK. You can go to the lecture 14 directory, open the README, and you will see that there are nothing to do. We are just going to deploy the new CDK changes. So let's go through the code. In the app directory, nothing has changed. No need to worry about it. There are just some minor modifications in the database stack and in the app.py file. So in the database stack, we have renamed it database and storage stack because we are about to create our S3 bucket inside this stack. And as we have renamed this stack, we need to import the new stack in app, make sure we instantiate the new stack, and make sure we use DynamoDB table from this new stack as we have renamed it. Okay, now in the database stack, the only thing that you need to create an S3 bucket is these 5 lines. It's a very small thing, a very small piece of code to just deploy a S3 bucket. We will name our bucket, and then we define a removal policy. The removal policy is for CDK. So if you want to remove this bucket from your stack, you need to tell CDK what CDK should do. In this case, the removal policy is set to destroy. It means that if we remove the bucket from the stack, CDK will completely remove the bucket, will completely delete the bucket. If you don't define this, by default, CDK will just keep your bucket as an orphan bucket. An auto-delete object is for CDK to know if it can or not delete the object inside your bucket. So the first line is about the bucket itself, and this line is about the object inside the bucket. Here, we've set it to true, so it means that CDK can auto-delete all the objects inside the bucket. So let me be clear. If we remove this bucket from the stack, CDK will first delete all the objects and then delete the bucket itself. For this lecture, as we are just learning, it's perfectly fine to define those settings. Now, if you are on a production environment, you probably don't want to set those to destroy and true because you want to make sure that you will not lose any data if you make some mistake in your stacks. That being said, with these lines of code, we have everything we need to deploy a S3 bucket, so let's do it. As usual, go to the right lecture. Okay. Make sure to start your virtual environment and go to the infra folder. And now we can deploy our new S3 bucket. Okay, now CDK asks us to confirm because we are about to change a bit the IAM statement, because as we are creating a new bucket, it means that we are creating also new rules to delete, get, or list objects from this bucket. But in this case, we want to create a bucket, it's not an error, so we just type Y and enter to validate those changes. Okay, now you can see that we successfully deployed our new S3 bucket. Let's go to S3 together to see if our CDK bucket was created successfully. Let's go to S3, and you can see now we have the bucket we have just created with CDK and the previous bucket we have created together in the console. So congratulations, now you know how to create a bucket using the AWS console and how to create a bucket with CDK. Well done! Now you can create and configure buckets. In the next lecture, we will connect our new S3 bucket to the API we have built together.